Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar today, using IMPLAN to advocate at the state and congressional district level within the energy industry. My name is Dr. Candy Klaus. I'm the Vice President of Customer Success and Education Services here at IMPLAN, and I will be serving as your host. And I am joined by my esteemed colleague, Dr. Geoffrey Brand, who is not only an IMPLAN Certified Economist, but he's also a specialist in the oil and natural gas market and policy arena.
It is a pleasure to be here, Candy. Candy, I am not seeing the slides. I just see a blank screen. So, I don't know if
Oh,
everybody else.
no. Is anyone seeing the slides? Let's see here. How about now?
Now I see something, yes.
All right. Clearly today is the day of technical difficulties on our end. Apologies to everyone.
And that's a picture of me. That's great.
Sorry about that. So thank you so much for joining us. If anyone has a question today while attending the webinar, feel free to raise your hand and we will call on you. And at that point, you can unmute yourself using the microphone, or you can ask a question in the chat bot as well, and we will get to those also. What we're going to talk about today is we're going to learn about Geoffrey Brand's experience using IMPLAN for policy advocacy and look at some current economic events, how the economic impact data supports the oil and natural gas industry, advocacy at the state and at the congressional district levels, and then examine the economic implications of steel tariffs specifically on drilling operations and the cost to the industry. So without further ado, getting to know Jeff. Tell me a little bit about yourself, professionally and personally.
Sure thing, Candy. I've been in the oil and gas industry for over 30 years. Started off with an undergraduate degree in geophysics. Later in life, I would earn a master's in mineral economics and then a PhD in, I guess, what we call regular economics. Both of my dissertations were focused on the oil and gas industry. Work-wise, I spent 11 years with a natural gas pipeline in Colorado. I was about 8 years in consulting, mostly consulting in natural gas markets. And for the past 15 years, I was a senior economic advisor at the American Petroleum Institute. I just recently wrapped up my time at API on March 1st, so that was about 4 weeks ago. Now I'm trying a little bit of independent consulting on the side. And for those who don't know, API is the largest trade association of the U.S. oil and gas industry and is headquartered in Washington, D.C.
Fantastic. How did you first get involved with the American Petroleum Institute and start using IMPLAN?
Well, the consulting firm I was working with at the time had API as a client. I moved over to API when an opportunity opened up. That was back in 2010. API was already a subscriber of IMPLAN when I got there. Since I had an advanced degree in economics, they put me in charge of most of the IMPLAN projects.
Fantastic. What kind of projects were you typically analyzing?
At API, we use IMPLAN a fair amount, actually. I'll be honest with you, for advocacy purposes, by far the most important metric for elected officials is employment. I mean, how many jobs a policy will create or how many jobs it will not or destroy. That is very, very important. Of course, IMPLAN is one of the most effective tools for estimating those type of impacts. We mainly had kind of two general buckets you could put our IMPLAN projects in. One would be what you consider a contribution analysis. Another would be a policy or regulatory analysis exercise. For the contribution studies, we would try to estimate the economic footprint of different sectors of our industry. For example, somebody might want to know, use IMPLAN to estimate the jobs, GDP, and labor income supported by the oil and gas drilling and production in a particular state. That kind of data is often ended up on our website, or you can also see that we produce materials to hand out to policymakers and other people who are interested. On the policy or regulatory analysis side, we will use IMPLAN to estimate economic impacts of regulations or proposed legislation or changes in policy. One early example back in 2010, there was drilling permits on federal lands were much lower with the change of administration. Therefore, the G.W. Bush administration, the Obama administration, drilling permits were lower. So we built a model trying to show what drilling and production might have been if those permitting had stayed at that higher level. And given that investment and production, we took those numbers, put them in IMPLAN, and estimated the economic impacts throughout the U.S. economy.
Wow, that's quite an undertaking. One more thing, I did mention it at the beginning, but you are one of the IMPLAN Certified Economists, and we are pleased to have you join us as one of these program members. What has been most beneficial to you as a member?
Being a member is a couple of things. Of course, an important one is gives you benefit is gives you credibility. Any one of your clients or your stakeholders will have more confidence in your results if you were certified. However, probably much more important than that, going through the certification process, it really forces you to develop a much deeper understanding of IMPLAN. You have to know all the assumptions of the model, the data sources, all of the strengths of the model. That makes your analysis much better and stronger. Also, another benefit, IMPLAN hosts a quarterly roundtable event, a conference call just for certified economists, where IMPLAN staff go over model and data updates, and we generally have a wonderful and interesting conversation.
Oh, well, thank you. Glad to hear that. Well, let's move into your expertise and how you leveraged IMPLAN. So you've been using IMPLAN at API for a long time. What initially led you to use IMPLAN?
Well, again, mainly it's because API was, of course, a subscriber when I got there. That was 15 years ago. But not going into the exact details, what really got me into IMPLAN was early on, maybe around 2011 or 2012, one of our API's contractors who was also using IMPLAN, I suspected they were almost but not quite using it correctly. And I thought they were actually double counting some things. But that led me to really get into the nitty gritty and details of how IMPLAN worked. And so I've been kind of getting into IMPLAN for the past 15 years.
What questions were you looking to answer with IMPLAN when you were originally working with it, and how's that evolved over time?
Well, certainly. At first, IMPLAN we would use would be pretty straightforward. We would just use the IMPLAN database itself. We would look at such things as the benefits of like the refining industry for the U.S. That is something that we actually calculate on. I think we do it practically every year and post it on our website. However, eventually we started to use a more sophisticated manner. We would combine IMPLAN with other data and other models. For example, you have to use other data sources to estimate offshore oil and gas development. I don't know if you know this, but onshore and offshore drilling are not separated in IMPLAN, mainly because they're not separated in the NAICS classification scheme. So even though they're rather quite different, so in order to estimate offshore oil and gas development, you need to find spending pattern data from other sources and then apply them to the IMPLAN sectors that actually do exist.
Very cool. How would you say IMPLAN compares to other things that you've used, and why do you prefer IMPLAN over other economic modeling tools?
Well, I mean, IMPLAN is great because it is data-driven and it is credible. And you can always say that the methodology is sound. I mean, the input-output methodology was essentially created by Vasily Leontiev. Again, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Anyway, he wanted thank you. He won the prize in 1973. And certainly API, being the oil and gas advocacy group, has been accused of inflating our numbers, but we could always say, well, this is a technique that all other people use, other governments use, and somebody won a Nobel Prize for it. So this is, again, a credibility on the methodology. You can kind of explain that. Also, another great thing about IMPLAN is the fact that you can generally explain how it works to a layperson. If you say that, well, this uses a matrix, looks at this industry, buys all these goods to all these other industries, and then this industry sells the goods to other industries, they can kind of get a good picture of it. Some of the other economic models out there are like I would consider black boxes, where you stick the numbers in and numbers come out, and you're not exactly sure where they come by. So people, even a person on the street can get a general idea how IMPLAN works. And also another very, very important aspect is that these numbers are, IMPLAN is based on official government numbers. So these are numbers that are produced by the basic input-output tables are from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, or BEA. So this is a US government or determining these economic relationships. That is very good. When somebody accuses you of like inflating numbers or making numbers smaller, you can always say that these are not our numbers, these are based on government numbers. That really reduces the criticism of user bias.
Thank you for saying that. That is one thing we're really proud of, that our data is not in a black box, that we readily share all of the over 90 data sources we use every year for our US annual data set, and that we will gladly show people exactly what the methodology is that we used to derive each of the values that sit inside of IMPLAN. So let's dive into what this looks like in policy and advocacy. How would you say your work with IMPLAN helps industries advocate for their projects and policies?
Well, certainly, if you want to advocate for something effectively, you got to have a strong message. If you want to have a strong message, you got to have real numbers backing it up. I mean, anybody can say this policy will create jobs, this policy will hurt the economy or good for the economy. But what really sticks is when you say this policy will create 12,500 jobs, and those jobs half are in manufacturing. Or you can say the message would be, this will bring an extra $1.5 billion to federal revenue. That type of message grabs people's attentions and builds credibility.
Can you give a specific example of how you've used IMPLAN in policymaking or public messaging?
Sure. Actually, just looking at the database itself, there's a ton of useful information in IMPLAN database even before you start running a model. There's obviously the standard employment, labor, income, and output by industry. But if you include it in IMPLAN, you get data on occupations, on environmental data like greenhouse gas emissions, and other environmental metrics. But in the past, we would just pull data directly from the database. For example, somebody wanted to know what are the direct jobs and labor income for a particular sector in a particular state. So somebody might want to know how many people are employed in drilling in Pennsylvania. We can get that number directly out of IMPLAN, and we can get their average labor compensation. And we can also compare that compensation to the average compensation statewide or to national averages. I like to point out, for a lot of the oil and gas industry sectors, they do pay better than the statewide or national averages.
It's interesting, you talked about some varying geographies over the course of the conversation so far. Why is that location-specific analysis, looking at different states, counties, congressional districts, so critical for your studies?
When it comes to advocacy, it's similar to real estate. It's all about location, location, location. I mean, a congressman wants to know what the numbers look like in their district. I mean, local officials want to know what is the jobs, what is the tax revenue generated in their own community. I mean, total jobs supported across the US is a much higher number, sounds great. But for an elected official, the real question is, how does this impact me, and how does it impact my constituents?
So very true. Thank you for sharing. Let's dive into the case study. I'm going to give you mouse control now, so you can take over from here.
Okay, let's see this. Let's see here. Make sure I do have mouse control. Let's see here. Up, down. Great. All right. Perfect. All right. Sure, Candy. This is API's flagship economic report. It is a main report that illustrates how important the U.S. Oil and gas industry is to the U.S. economy. It is contribution analysis, what we call it contribution analysis. An interesting note: API has been doing this report since 2008, and as you can, however, back in 2008, it was actually before IMPLAN even had a contribution and event type. So the analysis had to be done by editing the industry spending pattern. For those people who run IMPLAN know that a contribution analysis, the industry doesn't buy from itself, so it actually edit the spending pattern directly and reduce that, be able to industry to buy from itself. The report is authored by the accounting firm PwC, however, it is done with close collaboration with API. A new version of this report comes out every 2 years. Some of it's a little more, some of it's a little less. I think we skipped a couple of years during the COVID. It was not that the numbers were bad, actually they were bad, they were horrible, but like any other industry, but it didn't really represent the normal contribution to the U.S. economy. So when 2021 came around, we were able to do another report. My understanding is API will probably be producing another report this year. The executive summary you see under table 1 shows the top line results for the nation. We have our standard IMPLAN metrics: employment, labor income, and value added. We have the direct impacts. On top of the direct impacts, we add to it the indirect and induced. We have the operational impacts. We also, in this particular exercise, we look at capital investment for the various oil and gas industries. You look at the total numbers, employment, you can see that if you add direct and indirect and induced, the U.S. Oil and natural gas industry supports nearly 11 million jobs, or 10.8 million jobs in the entire U.S. That is 5.4% of the U.S. Jobs in the economy. Labor income is about 900 billion, and value added, or GDP, is about 1.8 billion, or 7.6% of the U.S. economy. The CEO of API, Mike Summers, let's call this the first 8%. Of course, he rounds up. That's because all other industries use energy in order for them to work. This is, again, our flagship report. It is practically used in everything, or it is quoted in practically any product that API produces. If you look at what I have here, this is a statement, and this statement is the bottom of every API press release. And API has a press release every day or every other day, so this comes out, multiple times per month. And the first line in here of this press release says that oil and gas industry supports nearly 11 million U.S. jobs, and that is a IMPLAN generated number. So it's very important in our API's advocacy. Of course, when you're talking about any contribution analysis, you got to define what you're talking about. This table here kind of shows how API defines the oil and gas industry. It essentially goes from all the way from drilling an oil well and production, through pipelines, to refineries, to the ultimate consumer at gas stations. There are 2.3 million direct jobs in the industry. That's the same as number as before, for these various sectors. $280 billion in labor income and $775 billion of direct GDP from the oil and gas industry. Some people have asked, why do we include gasoline stations? But that doesn't bother me, because to me, that is actually a part of our industry. Yes, they do sell candy bars, but they do sell our product to the ultimate consumer. And actually, most person on the street, that is their main connection to the oil and gas industry, is when they fill up their car. So that is why we include those numbers in our definition of the oil and natural gas industry. So, okay, and what I showed you before, the first time I showed you was the summary were the national results. And in the report, we are separated geographically by reports by state. So we have the table like this for all 50 states and the District of Columbia. This is the table for Pennsylvania. I can shows the economic impact of the industry on Pennsylvania itself. It is separated by the main IMPLAN metrics of employment, labor income, and value added. You have direct, indirect, and induced. You can kind of see that looking at employment, the direct employment was 93,060. That is 1.2% of the state's total jobs in the state of Pennsylvania. However, we add in indirect and induced, you can see that the industry supports 5.6% of all jobs in the state of Pennsylvania. So that's a good fair amount. If you look at the indirect and induced, we also separate that out by, gives you an idea of how it supports other parts of the Pennsylvania economy. How many manufacturing jobs it supports, how many construction jobs it supports. So you can see there that kind of adds up, and therefore people can get a good picture of how Pennsylvania is supported by the oil and gas industry, how the economy is there. However, that is a very, very boring and dry table. So we don't really, you can always download the entire report from the API website, but we mostly do not hand that out. We create these wonderful, concise, easy to read one-pagers so we can hand out to congressional staffers, you can hand out to people at the State House for the state government, you can hand out for anybody who wants, or you can even download it from the API website. This puts a much better view of those exact same numbers. You get some nice, great pictures. You get people in hard hats. It's always good to see. We also try to put things into context. If you look at the number of jobs supported, we have 423,000 jobs. Well, you can see that is essentially equal to 4 times the capacity of Beaver Stadium. Of course, people might not know what Beaver Stadium is, but if you're in Pennsylvania, of course, you know what that is. That is where Penn State plays. So, so the number of jobs supported in the Pennsylvania economy could fill that stadium by 4 times. So that's a good, that puts those numbers into context. In addition to looking at those direct numbers, we also have those 2-digit NAICS code categories of the other parts of the economy. You can see how it's far-reaching and impacts all parts of the economy, not just the oil and gas sector. And in fact, for every 1 job in Pennsylvania directly in oil and gas industry, it supports 3.6 additional jobs in the Pennsylvania economy. And you can see it's got it broken out by services, trade, construction, etc. So these are great handouts for advocacy purposes, and we have them pretty much for every state. So go to the next screen. Oop. That was the state by state. We also have in the report by congressional district. So we want to talk to a particular congressman or a particular some people in a particular area of the state. We can show them these numbers. This is essentially the totals all add up the same, but it separates out between the 17 different congressional districts. Each district, some districts are more impacted by oil and gas industry in Pennsylvania than others. That is mainly due to which districts have oil and gas production. So if people know what oil and gas production is in Pennsylvania, there's a lot of oil and gas production in the western part of the state. So that would be congressional districts 14 and 17. And if you look at the table here, you can see that those numbers are higher. 14 and 17, if you look at just the employment numbers, are like 14,000 jobs supported or 12,000 jobs supported in those 2 congressional districts. Also, there's also additional production in the northeast, so southwest and northeast part of the state. That'd be congressional districts 15 and 9, and those numbers are a little higher. So we can take these numbers and also produce similar one-pagers, but I think API doesn't do there's 435 congressional districts. We don't quite produce 435 one-pagers, just kind of produce them on an as-needed basis. But these numbers are here if you want to target a specific area and show how much the oil and gas industry is important in that area. There.
That's fantastic. Let's check the question box before we move on to the next section. We do have a couple that have come in here. Sure. First, let's talk about opportunity cost. Yes, lots of jobs in the oil and gas industry, but there are more than twice as many jobs in other sectors. So if we improve efficiency and reduce overall cost, the savings can be respent on other more job-intensive sectors.
That is correct. This is just showing, it's more like a snapshot in time. This particular model, the report here is for the 2021 IMPLAN database. There's now a 2023 IMPLAN database. That's showing the economic relationships for that particular time. If things become more efficient, you will actually have higher GDP with lower employment. So that's, but it just depends on, as you model it, it will, yeah, things will change as the economy evolves, correct.
Fantastic. Another question, what do you use as the input into IMPLAN? Well, we're going to get to that in a moment in your example. So I'll kind of pause on that one.
Well, actually, I can answer that. For this particular one is mostly contribution analysis. That's kind of using the number of jobs from that exist. So this is like looking backwards. So, you know, how many people are employed, what GDP is, those are government numbers are input in this particular report. Yeah.
So for the entirety of the state of Pennsylvania in this slide right here.
Exactly,
All right. IMPLAN can also report total output. Why does the API report not report out total output?
Well, total output is it could. It just is a little confusing because output you double count things. If I sell things 3 times or only sell it twice, then one is like 50% higher than the other, even though it's the same thing. So output is, I mean, I think GDP or value added is a much more better number to report to show the importance of the economy. Because if I have a service and I contracted for it, then and I sell my product, then I'm double counting that service versus if I do it myself, it's not double counted. So output is a less people do report it. It's just a metric that's less doesn't show as well how important is the economy as value add. I think value add is a much better thing to report.
I agree with you. Value added is also my favorite thing to report. Okay, next question. Is employment taken from the BLS non-farm payrolls? As he said in this example here, this is contribution analysis. So these are taken from the IMPLAN data set, what the direct, indirect, and induced would be. And there are, as I mentioned earlier, 90 different data sources, BLS non-farm payrolls being one of the data sources that we do use. On our website, support.implan.com, you can find details on everything that goes into our employment numbers as well.
A good point there would be that these numbers will probably be a bit higher because it includes sole proprietorships and independent contractors, which are not necessarily in the BLS data.
Fantastic. All right. Well, let's jump into the next section.
Okay. Current event analysis. Okay. All right. IMPLAN asked me to do something interesting and current for this webinar. And of course, tariffs are very current and perhaps a little too interesting, especially if you're looking at your 401k balance. But there has been a lot of turmoil in the markets the past week. There are many factors that can impact well drilling, uncertainty being a big one. Oil price is another big one. I haven't checked the latest hour, but it was down to like $58 per barrel. However, this analysis is going to look solely at the potential impact of steel tariffs. Therefore, if steel tariffs increase the cost of drilling a well, how can it impact the number of wells drilled and the economic impacts? So, in order to consider the scope of how steel impacts, how steel tariff might impact wells, it's good to ask a couple of key questions. So, what questions can this be? And as I get back here, all right, okay. Well, first of all, what type of steel products are used in drilling oil and gas wells? There's a lot of steel used in drilling oil and gas wells. We have the production equipment, the rigs are all made out of steel. But well casing, that is the pipe that goes down the well, is something they use at each well. So if you drill a well 10,000 feet down and 15,000 feet to the side, that's 25,000 feet of pipe, all made out of steel, that is cemented in place. And you got to get more pipe again for the next well. So that is where the largest portion of steel products used in drilling an oil and gas well is that casing pipe. And that casing pipe is called oil country tubular goods, or OCTG. That's just a name that's been around for a very long time. Okay, what is the average cost of an OCTG well for a typical well? Actually, each average well cost in the U.S., and these numbers come from Rystad Energy, and I have it highlighted in yellow, just saying thank you, Rystad Energy, for providing the data for this analysis. But each well at a $7 million well costs a little over $1 million per well, and it accounts for 15% of the total cost. So you're putting in $1 million of pipe into every well, typical well drilled in the United States. As I said, the average well is roughly 7 million. There are certainly horizontal wells that are much more expensive and vertical wells are cheaper, but $7 million is roughly the average cost of a typical well onshore US for the past 2 years. Another question you might ask is how much OCTG pipe does the US import annually? That's a very good question. And if you look at the average over the past 2 years, we imported roughly $3.6 billion of casing pipe. and that makes up roughly 24% of the market on average. 2 years ago, it was a little higher, around 30%, and last year was a little less. I think it was around 16 or 17%. So I'm just using for this analysis roughly around 24%. Those numbers come from the U.S. Census Bureau. They have a steel report every month, so those numbers are very easy to get. If anyone wants to go on the U.S. Census Bureau and look at the month, every month, how much we import on the various steel products, that's very easy to find. So how might this rising pipe cost impact well drilling? Well, with many capital budgets, a lot of people who drill wells, their capital budgets are set ahead of time. So if you have capital budgets set ahead of time, higher costs might lead to a reduction in the number of wells drilled. Many smaller companies use ongoing operations to fund their next well. So they sell oil and gas in 1 year, use that money for the next year. They don't necessarily borrow money if costs go up. So if the next year costs go up, they will just have less money. They will just essentially react to the higher prices by drilling fewer wells. Also, many of the larger firms also have pretty much like to keep their capital budgets set ahead of time, even though they probably could increase their spending to cover those higher costs, but they, in essence, especially in times of uncertainty, might be hesitant to increase what they spend on a capital budget. So having a fixed capital budget is probably a good assumption. All right, before we get into what the impact of well tariffs are, let's look at what the total U.S. drilling economic impact is typically. This is for 23 and 24. You can see the average number of wells drilled in the past 2 years, roughly 14,500. This detailed well cost is also from Rystad Energy. You can see they estimate that the average well was roughly $7 million per well, and OCTG pipe costs are roughly $1 million of that. Other costs include drilling services like rig rental, stimulation is also known as fracking, facilities, that's like your production equipment, propent, that is essentially sand, that is the frac sand you use in a hydraulically fracturing well. Fuel and power is mostly diesel fuel and water. They use a lot of water both in the drilling and in the fracking operations. So anyway, if you take that $7 million per well and you multiply it by 14,575, or the number of wells that were drilled, you get roughly like the last 2 years, they spent roughly a little over $100 billion per year, or $104 billion per year in drilling oil and gas wells. So that's a fair amount of money and investment injected into the U.S. economy. If you take on a percentage basis, it's not very, since everything's roughly 100, so 15.2 billion is roughly 15% of the total cost. And then we take those detailed well cost numbers, which are generated by, estimated by Rystad, and we apply them to IMPLAN sector codes in order to run an IMPLAN model. Here they are. OCTG pipe comes under iron and steel and ferroalloy products. If you see a 32 in front of it, that means I'm using it as a commodity event. If it only has 2 digits, I'm using it as an industry event. And for those people who want to know the difference between the two, I'm sure IMPLAN has many videos explaining the difference between the two. But anyways, so I have these sectors and I have these dollar amounts. And in order to get the economic impact, I will just put that into the latest and greatest IMPLAN impact model. This is the 2023 IMPLAN model itself. And you can see I have casing pipe at the top. That is that $15.2 billion in there. That's under the iron and steel and ferroalloy products. I changed the local purchase percentage. That local purchase percentages matches that 24% of imports we're doing. The region is the total U.S. Therefore, the local purchase, we purchase 76% of the pipe and we import 24%. So I have that local purchase percentage at 76%. And I have all the other categories below it. We got everything input into the model. We hit go. And what do we get? This is what we get. So this shows you the impact of oil and gas drilling in the U.S. the summary overview results are shown here. You got employment, labor income, GDP, and output. You can see that drilling in the past 2 years roughly supported 800,000 US jobs. Of those 800,000, 265,000, roughly 1/3, were direct jobs in the operations. Labor income was roughly $74 billion, and it supported roughly $131 billion of GDP. So you spend $104 billion in drilling oil and gas wells, you get $131 billion, and you get of GDP impact. That is due to the multiplier effect. I've also taken the employment and split it out a little bit, so little details to which industry sectors are impacted the most. The highest direct employment is going to be the support activities for oil and gas operations. That would be the fracking crews, the set preparation, and those type of people. There's roughly 51,000 people employed by the drilling of oil and gas wells. Those are like the rig crews and people who have to work for the same company. Sand and gravel mining, that is about people who are providing the frac sand. There's about 29,000 people employed in that. Other governments, enterprise, you see that under employment. What is that? Well, that is the water. Most people buy water from the government. They don't actually buy it from private water firms. So that's why you'll see a fairly high number of government jobs supported by oil and gas drilling as when they buy the water. So that is the total U.S. Impact on an annual basis. So now, how do we estimate the steel tariff impacts? So 25% steel tariff on $3.6 billion of pipe imports. Well, that would result in the government collecting $900 million per year. That'd be assuming if the quantity and price remain unchanged. So what should we do with that $900 million? One thing we could do is we could just take that $900 million and add it to our OCTG event line. So that would take, before we had $15.2 billion in our IMPLAN model. If we increase to 16.1 billion, what would that do? Would that be a good idea? That would probably be not a good idea. Why is that? Because the model is calibrated on 2023 economic and price relationships. So if we added $900 million to that one line, it would show an increase in our domestic employment of pipe. It would show like an increase in our domestic labor income in producing our OCTG pipe. But we're anticipating if costs go up, we'll produce less pipe and we'll actually drill fewer wells. So that is not a good idea just to add $900 million in the IMPLAN model. You would probably get an incorrect result. Well, what else could we do? Well, maybe we could take that $900 million in a 1923 model and reduce well expenditures. Would that be a good idea? Well, we're getting closer, but probably not a good idea either, because all pipe costs for well exposure are likely to increase. Why is that? Domestic suppliers are probably expected to raise pipe prices to match the cost of marginal supply. And the marginal cost of supply is going to be those foreign pipe imports. So, and actually, if you read a lot of the trade press or trade publications, many people who are drilling oil and gas wells are at least bracing for a 25% increase in all pipe costs, not just the imported ones. So what should we do? Maybe to run the model, we can take that increase in costs, apply it to the entire $15.2 billion we spend annually on pipe, and that would be estimate a $3.7 billion increase OCTG cost. And so instead of that cost goes up, we have that much less to spend on drilling wells. So this is probably a good idea. This is exactly what I did. So if those pipe goes up as we were expected, foreign imports will set the market price. A market run using 2023 IMPLAN model runs with $3.7 billion reduction in the amount of wells we actually drill. It will give you a good estimate of employment and labor impacts. Okay, so we take that 104 billion before, we now reduce it by $3.7 billion and run the model again. That would probably be a good idea of what's going to happen to employment and labor. GDP impacts are much more complicated. Why is that? Well, GDP is a dollar concept, and essentially if the domestic casing pipe producers are selling their product at a higher price. They're actually selling, contributing more to nominal GDP. So even though they're selling fewer pipes, maybe, but if they're selling at a higher price, the total dollar amount is higher, they're actually creating more nominal GDP. So therefore, GDP numbers in this type of analysis, you can calculate it, but I think the results would be more confusing to people. So the best bet would be not to report it at all, which that is my plan not to. It would probably not be a good idea. All right, so how are we going to model this? We're going to take the first, this is our first, what we did the first time. That's where we got the 800,000 jobs supported throughout the US. We had these cost categories by IMPLAN. We have our base case. We have a total expenditure of $104 billion, and our number of wells are roughly 14,500 wells. So if we took the same number of wells, the 14,500, added a 25% tariff, you can kind of see that you would have spent $108 million to essentially produce that same amount of wells, given that increased costs in the OCTG casing pipe. But we can't spend it. We're assuming a constant capital budget. So we're going to reduce everything back down to that $104.5 billion for this analysis. In order to do that, we have to reduce the number of wells drilled by 500. So roughly 3.5% fewer wells, and essentially all the cost categories go down accordingly. So given that, however, we don't want to model these numbers because that first line, the iron, steel, and ferroalloy products, is the model's not calibrated to match that price and economic relationships. So we'll just take that $15.2 billion and knock it down by 3.5%. So we're going to model this IMPLAN 23 cost relationships of what if we drill 14,063 pipes instead of the 14,575, and that should get us the economic impact of what a steel tariff cost would be. So we could take the first column based annual expenditures, take the fourth column and run them both and subtract the two. Easiest way, IMPLAN is a linear model. Therefore, we can just take the difference in those two dollars by cost category, and then just model a negative $3.7 billion economic impact. That will essentially show you what was the economic impact, at least for employment and labor income, of what if you essentially drilled 500 fewer wells with that added cost. All right, so here is the impact screen, very similar to the one you saw for the total impact for US wells, but this just has that $3.7 billion in delta. Casing pipe is at $534 million. I still have the commodity output local purchase percentage the same at 76%. You can argue whether that should change, but for this analysis, I'm keeping it the same. And then we just hit go, and this is what the impact is. So this is the summary results screen. Again, we got employment, labor income, and the last two categories, value added and output, are not necessarily meaningful in this analysis, so you can just ignore those. But for the employment, you can see that a reduction in 500 wells drilled could essentially show that 28,000 jobs, less jobs are supported in the US economy, and labor income will go down by $2.6 billion. So that could be impact of essentially reducing that economic activity by drilling fewer wells, and that's the impact on employment and labor income. A more detailed look at the individual sectors, the direct sectors and drilling of oil and gas, the support activities for oil and gas operations, the industries that fall into that category. You can see it's reduced by roughly 4,600 jobs supported in that particular sector of the industry. Drilling crews and associated companies show a reduction of 1,800 jobs, and sand and gravel mining could show a reduced number of jobs supported in that industry by 1,000. So that is in essence the analysis I have. So this is just kind of repeating what I just told you. The economic impact of US oil and natural gas drilling, the total impact, we drill roughly 14,500 14,500 wells each year, a little over $100 billion per year. That supports 800,000 jobs, 74 billion in labor income, 131 billion in GDP. Direct jobs around 265K, 32 billion in labor income, $58 billion in GDP. Our casing pipe imports, we import roughly $3.6 billion per year, or 24% of the market. That could generate it at those 25% tariff, could generate up to $900 million in government revenue if quantity and cost remain the same. However, domestic prices could rise 25% or $3.7 billion if import with a steel tariff in place. And the economic consequences of higher pipe costs would be $3.7 billion less for drilling if budgets remain constant, 500 fewer wells drilled in the U.S. due to increased costs, 28,000 fewer jobs, supported economy, and a reduction of $2.6 billion in labor income. GD impacts, just like many things in life, it's complicated. So that is, in essence, my analysis.
And I think you have one more slide to go through. Yep.
Oh, thank you. My God. Yeah. Thank you, Candy. That is my analysis before my caveats and disclaimers. Of course. Yeah. There's a lot of caveats here. Other market forces, factors, especially price, will impact the number of wells drilled. So this is trying to isolate what increase in cost will impact, just that particular factor. Of course, drillers may adjust their capital budgets in response to cost changes, but given the uncertainty in the market, I think most drillers would be hesitant to increase their capital budgets. Foreign, this is a very important one, foreign pipe suppliers might lower their prices to remain competitive. And if they reduce their prices, that will reduce the cost increases on U.S. drillers. However, additional supply chain costs from steel and other tariffs are not included in this analysis. So as other costs go up, those will also have a downward impact on the number of wells drilled and also a downward impact on the economic footprint in the United States. There, now I'm done. Am I right, Candy?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that detailed analysis. We've got some really good questions that came in. So I want to just jump right in. In no particular order, how do you separate indirect and induced impacts between capital and operations?
Well, this particular analysis was only looking at the drilling of oil and gas wells, which is a capital expenditures. If you're doing between capital expenditures and production, this did not include production in here. So this would just look at, that is something where you need to make sure you're not double counting things. Because certainly when you sell oil and natural gas, that revenue creates GDP, but then if you add to it the oil and natural gas drilling, which is a capital expenditure, that money you made from selling the oil and gas product, you don't want to double count that GDP. So, but in essence, for this particular one, there was, this is straight operations of drilling. It wasn't looking at investment in oil rigs or anything like that. So this was strictly an operation looking at specifically drilling of oil and gas wells.
Perfect. All right. How did you go from new cost with tariff, same capital budget, to IMPLAN 2023 cost relationships?
Well, all I did was, in essence, took the $15.1 billion and multiplied it by 1.25. It got the higher cost, and that gave us like the $19 billion, I think. But then to get the relationships, I had to model because the labor and the employment and the labor income are based on price and economic relations without that tariff higher price. So in order to get, if I'm selling $18 billion worth of pipe, the 2023 relationship, I have to essentially reduce that dollar amount by 25% to match the calibration that's in the 2023 model. I hope I explained
that. If not, we'll get another question, I think.
Okay.
If time allows, can you walk through the methodology on slide 25 one more time? I think that was the impacts screen.
slide 25. This is slide 20. Well, this is just the impact screen. This is in essence the numbers that were in the previous screen. So if you go to slide 24, it is that delta base. You know, you get these are like large numbers, but this is the 500 million is that OCTG. That's where those numbers are. So that 3.7 billion there is those are the inputs by IMPLAN industry or commodity. And they're highly rounded here, where you can see like that first line is 500 million. You go to the next slide, you see that same number in much more detailed. It's 534,822,000. So, but those numbers are the same. One is just highly, just keep things simple. I didn't want the so many numbers on the previous screen.
All the zeros, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So it was just trying to be for simplicity, but those numbers are essentially the same. Yeah.
Okay. Are these economic impacts in terms of dollars already inflation adjusted? If that is the case, what is the assumption for inflation that was used?
Well, the inflation adjusted, I just used the 2024 dollars. So this is it is using the 2023 database. This is for 2024. So this is the impact of 2024 dollars in the economy. So I did not adjust them for like going into the future to 2025 or 2026. I'm only 2025. I used everything in 2024 dollars. So I really didn't have an inflation assumption. I just assumed that it would be economic impacts using 2024 dollars.
And on the results screen, you could put those in any dollar year you want to adjust for the changes year over year. If you wanted to look at in the past or the future, you could just change the dollar year you're viewing your results in.
Exactly.
All right. These are the benefits. Is there a way to quantify the environmental impacts or costs of oil and gas operations? There sure is. There's a tab that will show up in your results that will show the environmental impacts that are associated with any impact that we run. Unfortunately, any change in the economy when we're adding jobs and output is going to see a negative environmental impact. So the cutting of various wells, cutting back 500 wells will actually be a positive for the environment. So anytime, those are going to just always be inverse relationships. But very detailed results are available on the environmental tab that will show how those play out. All right, we have a couple people asking if you would mind sharing your slides afterwards. If that would be okay with you.
That would be totally fine with me.
All right, we will make sure that happens. And I had one more I lost up in here that was okay, here it is. I'm sorry. I don't think it's reasonable to assume the full 25% tariff would be passed along, particularly if demand is falling dollar for dollar. Can this be discussed? I'd really like to get thoughts on this.
Oh yeah, actually that was one of my bullets at the end under my caveats and whatever disclaimers. Yeah, foreign OCTG suppliers might lower prices and remain competitive in the U.S. And they probably won't like it, but they still might do it. So in essence, if they ate say of the 25%, so they reduce their prices by 5%, then these impact just for the steel tariffs alone would only be with that 80% of the impacts you're seeing. IMPLAN is linear. However, this is only looking at the steel costs for just for the pipe. If other costs from the other products they use, and not the pipe costs, but the other products in the drilling process also go up, then that might counteract the reduction of foreign suppliers reducing their price. So yes, that would exactly what happened. They would if they reduce their price to remain competitive, eat some of that tariff themselves, that would reduce the economic impact. But other things are also increasing the price of drilling that are not included in this analysis.
Thank you for clarifying that and reiterating those points that I think are super important in any kind of analysis, that we really want to make sure that there are those kind of disclaimers that we have Really important when we're talking with our constituents, reporting these results. Okay, here's another related one. The increase of 25% in sales could be misleading. The 25% increase is only for tariffs. Tariffs represent only a portion of the total cost. Therefore, we may overestimate these impacts. Can you explain?
Well, actually, and as I mentioned before, most people you look at the trade press, and if the marginal supply of pipe, which will be 24% is a large, or we have someone with even 30% one year, is a large portion of the pipe supply. Therefore, the highest cost pipe is going to be the foreign imports. And if that is the marginal supply, that will be setting the price. And actually, all domestic suppliers will also match that price because just through competition of selling pipe, the market force will drive it to that marginal price or the cost of foreign imports. So you can't have, there's no way to separate domestic and imports, and domestic suppliers will not sell at a lower price because a lot of them have domestic supplies and they also import. So if they want to buy pipe for themselves to essentially hand out to the drillers out there, they are looking at their own costs and they know they might have to buy foreign imports themselves. So the market force will drive it up to that marginal supply, which is the foreign imports.
Well, and with that, I think we have gone through all of the questions in the box. If I'm going to go through here real quick, we do have additional resources available on our website. Visit IMPLAN.com. IMPLAN.com/energy will get you to some energy-specific resources. If you want a demo, contact sales@implan.com and we will get you in touch with someone. If you want to connect with Jeff, have further questions or anything like that, Geoffrey.brand@gmail.com, or you can find him on LinkedIn here. We want to thank you all for joining us today. If you have any questions, feel free. You can always reach out to support@implan.com. That gets you to our customer success team here at IMPLAN. Or again, reach out to Jeff on one of these platforms. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. Thank you especially to you, Jeff, for putting together such a thoughtful analysis on such a very hot topic.
It was my pleasure, Candy.
Awesome. Everyone have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.